Mountain Monsters ran for 8 seasons and produced one of the most loyal audiences in paranormal television history. Then it was canceled. The official explanation was the kind of vague, institutional non-answer that networks provide when the real explanation is something they have decided the audience does not need to know. What the official explanation left out is what this video documents in full. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because the real reason Mountain Monsters was canceled changes everything about what the show was. When Mountain Monsters ended its run on Travel Channel, the official communication about the cancellation was the specific kind of non-communication that the cable television industry produces when it has decided that the audience's relationship to the show it is canceling does not entitle that audience to a complete account of the decision. There was no formal announcement, no network statement whose specific language addressed the question of why a franchise with 8 seasons of production history and one of the most demonstrably loyal audience bases in the paranormal television genre's history was being concluded rather than continued. There was the absence of a renewal, the specific silence of an institution that has made a decision it does not intend to defend publicly, a silence whose character communicates something specific about the nature of the decision it is managing. The Mountain Monsters audience noticed, not immediately, the gap between the end of the show's broadcast run and the community's full recognition that the absence of renewal represented a permanent conclusion rather than a production hiatus produced a period of uncertainty whose resolution the network's silence did nothing to accelerate, but eventually the recognition arrived. Mountain Monsters was canceled. The official explanation, to the extent that the network's silence constitutes an explanation, attributed the cancellation to the ordinary commercial considerations that the cable television industry applies to programming decisions: ratings, audience demographics, the competitive landscape of the paranormal documentary genre whose proliferation across the cable television space had increased the competitive pressure on individual franchise performances. These explanations are not false. They are incomplete. They are the portion of the complete explanation that the network was willing to put in the public domain, the commercially defensible account of a decision whose complete motivation the official communication was specifically designed not to fully represent. What the official explanation left out is what the investigation this video documents has been able to establish through the accounts of people whose proximity to the production and the network relationship during the show's final seasons gave them knowledge of the complete picture that the public record does not contain. The Mountain Monsters production during its final seasons was operating in a context whose specific character the broadcast episode's continued entertainment presentation did not reflect, and that the people closest to the production during that period have described in accounts whose consistency establishes a picture of the show's final chapter that the official cancellation narrative has never incorporated. The most significant element of that context was Trapper's health. John Richard Tice's physical condition in the period leading up to his death on December 16, 2019, had been deteriorating across a timeline whose relationship to the production's final seasons is more directly relevant to understanding the cancellation than the official explanation has acknowledged. The production was aware of Trapper's health situation. The network was aware of it, and the specific question that awareness produced for both the production and the network, the question of what Mountain Monsters was without the personality whose presence was the show's most essential and most irreplaceable element, was a question whose answer neither party was eager to address publicly during the period when the show's continuation was still being managed as an ongoing operation. Mountain Monsters without Trapper was a different show, not a worse show in every dimension. Buck's leadership potential, Huckleberry's steady presence, Wild Bill's tracking expertise, and the collective personality of the Ames team were genuine assets whose individual value was real independent of the framework that Trapper's leadership provided for them, but a categorically different show in the specific sense that what the audience's loyalty had been built around, the specific quality of Trapper's authority, humor, and mountain wisdom, was not something that the production's existing cast could replicate through any reconfiguration of the format. The network understood that, the production understood it, and the specific calculation that understanding produced about the show's commercial prospects in the post-Trapper landscape and about the audience's relationship to a Mountain Monsters whose organizing personality was gone is the element of the cancellation's complete motivation that the official explanation was most specifically designed not to address. Travel Channel's relationship to mountain monsters across the show's broadcast history was never the straightforward commercial partnership whose surface appearance the production's continued renewal across 8 seasons suggested. The network's investment in the franchise was real. 8 seasons of production represent a sustained commitment whose commercial logic the audience's demonstrated loyalty provided a basis for. But the specific character of the network's relationship to what the show was, to the specific combination of regional authenticity, paranormal investigation format, and ensemble personality that mountain monsters represented, had been evolving across the show's run in ways that the broadcast episode's continued production did not fully reflect. Travel Channel's programming strategy during the final seasons of Mountain Monsters' broadcast run was shifting in a direction whose specific character was not entirely compatible with what Mountain Monsters represented as a franchise. The network was moving toward a paranormal programming identity whose production values, presentation style, and audience demographic targeting were more aligned with the higher budget, more dramatically produced paranormal franchises that were performing strongly in the competitive landscape of the mid to late cable paranormal genre. Mountain Monsters was not that kind of show. Its appeal was built on the specific authenticity of its cast and the specific regional character of its investigation environment. Qualities whose commercial value the audience's loyalty demonstrated, but whose relationship to the network's evolving programming identity was becoming more complicated as the network's strategic direction developed. The question of whether Mountain Monsters' format and identity were compatible with where Travel Channel was going as a network, and whether the investment required to continue the production was justified by the commercial returns in a competitive landscape that the network's strategic priorities were orienting toward different kinds of paranormal content, was the question that the network's cancellation decision was answering without stating. The Mountain Monsters investigation record from the show's final seasons contains findings whose specific character contributed to the network's assessment of the show's future in ways that the official cancellation narrative has not addressed. The show's investigation format had been evolving across its seasons in a direction whose endpoint the final seasons were approaching, a direction whose character reflected the accumulated investigation experience of the Ames team and the specific deepening of the investigation's engagement with the Appalachian phenomenon that sustained field work in the most evidentially active areas of their investigation territory had been producing. The evidence the investigations were generating in the final seasons was more significant in its character than the broadcast episode's entertainment presentation fully represented. Not in the dramatic sense of more extreme creature encounters. The show's creature hunt format had always prioritized dramatic presentation over evidentiary precision in ways that the Ames team's genuine field experience sometimes chafed against. In the specific sense of a body of accumulated investigation evidence whose implications for the show's central premise, the existence of the creatures the investigation was pursuing, had been building toward a point that the ongoing search format the show's commercial framework depended on was increasingly struggling to contain. When an investigation show gets close enough to its subject that the distance between the dramatic tension of ongoing search and the resolution of confirmed discovery narrows to the point where the format's commercial premise is at risk, the institutional response is rarely to broadcast the discovery. It is to manage the distance. Travel Channel's ability to manage that distance in the Mountain Monsters context was complicated by the specific character of the Ames team's investigation methodology, the practical, on-the-ground field approach, whose results were produced by genuine fieldwork, rather than by the controlled production environment that more scripted paranormal formats use to manage the relationship between investigation findings and broadcast content. The team was finding things. The network was managing what the audience was shown of those things, and the sustainability of that management in the final seasons, given the investigation's momentum and given the specific evidence the final seasons were producing, was a calculation whose outcome the cancellation decision reflects. The Mountain Monsters broadcast record contains within its episode history a pattern whose specific character, the distribution of the show's most significant investigation sessions across its seasons, the editorial decisions that shaped how those sessions were presented to the audience, and the specific gaps between what the broadcast record contains and what the complete investigation archive is known to contain, points at the real reason for the cancellation in a way that the official explanation's commercial rationale does not. The show's most evidentially significant investigation sessions were concentrated in the later seasons, the period when the Ames team's accumulated field experience and their deepening knowledge of the most active investigation territories in their Appalachian range had given them the capability to access areas and to produce evidence of a quality that the earlier season's less experienced field approach approach had not achieved. The broadcast presentation of those later season investigations shows an editorial pattern whose character is consistent with the management of evidence whose complete representation would have exceeded the ongoing search format's capacity to contain it. Investigation sessions that the production's field documentation indicates produced significant findings are presented in broadcast form, whose relationship to what the complete session footage contained reflects the specific editorial compression that significant evidence management produces. The coverage of active investigation periods in summary narration rather than direct documentation, the reference to findings without the full presentation of what those findings consisted of, and the specific quality of the broadcast episode's most significant investigation moments feeling abbreviated in a way that the show's prior handling of comparable investigation sessions did not produce. The pattern is not conclusive on its own, but its consistency across the final seasons, the concentration of editorially compressed investigation presentations in the period when the Ames team's investigation capability was at its most developed, is consistent with the picture of a production whose most significant findings were being managed by the network's editorial process rather than fully broadcast, and whose cancellation reflected in part the network's assessment that the management was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The accounts of people whose proximity to the Mountain Monsters production and to the network relationship during the show's final seasons gave them knowledge of the complete picture that the official explanation does not contain are the most direct evidence available of what the official explanation left out. Those accounts are not fully in the public record. The professional and personal relationships that the people with the most direct knowledge maintain with the production and with the network create constraints on full public disclosure that the accounts available reflect. But what has been communicated in the partial, carefully worded accounts that people with direct knowledge provide when they are willing to speak about what the official explanation omitted is enough to establish the character of what the complete picture contains. The production personnel whose involvement in the final seasons gave them direct knowledge of the network relationship during that period have described a quality of institutional discomfort with the direction the investigation was taking that the straightforward commercial rationale of the official explanation does not account for. The discomfort was not about the show's performance metrics. The audience loyalty that Mountain Monsters had built across 8 seasons was demonstrable, and the network's awareness of it was reflected in the continued renewal that preceded the cancellation. It was about something more specific, about the character of what the investigation was producing in its final seasons, and about the network's assessment of what continuing to broadcast that production would eventually require the editorial process to manage in a way that the network had decided was not compatible with its programming objectives. The Ames team members whose public communications about the cancellation have been the most substantive, whose accounts of the show's conclusion have gone furthest toward the complete explanation while remaining within the constraints of their ongoing professional and personal relationships to the production, have described the cancellation in terms that are consistent with the picture of a network that had made a decision about the show's future based on considerations that the official commercial rationale does not fully represent. What those considerations were is what the following section of this video addresses directly. John Richard Tice's death on December 16, 2019 occurred within the timeline of the Mountain Monsters cancellation decision in a way whose specific relationship to that decision the official explanation has never addressed. The cancellation did not occur because of Trapper's death. The network's assessment of the show's future was already in process before the death occurred and was shaped by the complete picture of the show's situation during its final seasons, rather than by a single event whose timing the production could not have predicted. But Trapper's death confirmed something about the cancellation decision that the official explanation's commercial rationale leaves implicit rather than stating that the network's assessment of what Mountain Monsters was without its most essential personality was the foundation of a decision whose commercial logic the audience's loyalty alone was not sufficient to override. The specific question that the network's assessment had been building toward across the final seasons, the question of what Mountain Monsters was as a franchise in the absence of the personality whose presence defined its most fundamental appeal, was answered definitively by Trapper's death in a way that removed the ambiguity that the ongoing production context had maintained. Whatever the network's cancellation decision had been based on before December 16, 2019, the death of the show's organizing personality transformed the decision's context From a commercial calculation about a franchise whose future was uncertain into a confirmation of what the calculation had established. Mountain Monsters without Trapper was a different show. The network had already decided that the different show was not what they were going to continue investing in. Trapper's death made that decision's foundation visible in a way that the official explanation's vague commercial rationale had been designed to avoid making visible. And the combination of what the official explanation left out, the investigation evidence management, the network's strategic direction, the production's awareness of Trapper's health situation, and the specific calculation about the show's post-Trapper viability, is the complete account of why Mountain Monsters was really canceled that the audience that built 8 seasons of loyalty to the Ames team has never been given. The Mountain Monsters. Ames team members' public communications about the show's cancellation are a study in the specific art of saying something significant while remaining within the constraints of what professional relationships and personal loyalties permit to be said fully. Buck, Huckleberry, Wild Bill, Jeffro, and Willie have each made public communications about the show's conclusion, whose specific content, what they say, how they say it, and most significantly what the consistent gaps in their accounts indicate about what they are choosing not to say, points at the complete explanation in a way that the official account does not. Buck's public communications about the cancellation have been the most substantive of the cast members' accounts, reflecting his position as the team's post-Trapper leader and his understanding that the audience's investment in the Ames team entitles them to more than the network's institutional non-answer. What he has said about the cancellation describes a decision-making process whose character was more complicated than the commercial rationale suggests, without fully characterizing the nature of the complication. The specific language he uses, the careful distinctions between what the network decided and what the team understood about why the decision was made, the references to the show's investigation producing things that the broadcast format was not always equipped to contain, and the specific quality of resignation in his communications about the conclusion, is the language of a man who understands more about the complete explanation than his professional relationships permit him to state plainly. The other team members' communications are more constrained and more consistent in their restraint, reflecting the specific position of people whose relationship to the production and to the network was more bounded than Buck's leadership role created, and whose public statements about the cancellation reflect those boundaries. What the combined communications of the Ames team members establish about the real reason, not through what they say but through the consistent shape of what they do not say, is a picture whose outline is clear enough to read even in the absence of the direct statement that none of them has made. The real reason Mountain Monsters was canceled, the complete account whose assembly from the available evidence this video has constructed across its preceding sections, changes the show's legacy in a specific and consequential way. It changes the cancellation from the story of a franchise that ran its commercial course in a competitive television landscape into the story of a production whose investigation was getting close enough to something real that the institutional framework around it made a decision about what continuing to broadcast that investigation would eventually require. That distinction matters for the audience that built 8 seasons of loyalty to the Ames team because it changes what 8 seasons of Mountain Monsters represents. If the show was canceled for the commercial reasons the official explanation suggests, the broadcast record is the complete record, the full account of what the investigation produced across its run. If the show was canceled for the reasons the complete explanation establishes, the broadcast record is the managed fraction of a complete investigation record whose most significant findings the network's editorial process was containing in the final seasons, and whose continued containment the cancellation made permanent. The Ames team members who have continued their investigation work through the Sons of Appalachia channel, who have gone back into the Appalachian Mountains without the broadcast infrastructure, and without the network relationship and without Trapper, are doing something whose significance the complete explanation of the cancellation makes more legible than the official account permits. They are continuing an investigation that the institutional framework around Mountain Monsters decided to stop, not because the investigation had run out of territory to cover or evidence to find, because the investigation had been finding things whose continued documentation the institutional framework had assessed as something it was not willing to continue supporting. Buck and Huckleberry and Wild Bill are in those mountains without travel channel and without the production infrastructure and without the man who built everything. They are finding things. The findings are not being managed by a network's editorial process, and whatever the Appalachian Mountains produce for the Sons of Appalachia operation, whatever the investigation that Mountain Monsters was really canceled for approaching continues to produce in the men who have refused to stop approaching it, is the next chapter of a story whose real first chapter, the official explanation of why the show ended, has always been designed to obscure. The real reason Mountain Monsters was canceled is the reason the investigation continues. And the investigation continues because the men who built it know what it was getting close to.